Hey everyone, and welcome back to Revise and Resubmit. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita, glad to be back with you for another deep dive.
This time we're heading to Pakistan to explore how Muslim women working in banks experience spatial modesty.
We're looking at a paper from the Journal of Management Studies. It's an FT50 journal.
Wow, so it must have gone through some really rigorous review, right?
Oh, absolutely. These are serious researchers we're talking about today.
Okay, so who are these scholars?
The authors are Chaudhry from the University of Central Lancashire.
Impressive.
And Vincenza Priola from the Open University.
Two big names in their fields. So this paper is titled Spatial Modesty, the Everyday Production of Gendered Space in Segregated and Assimilative Organizations. I'm already hooked.
It's a fascinating one. Chaudhry and Priola focused on two very different banks in Pakistan.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, first we have a multinational American bank. Let's call it Western Bank for now.
Got it. When I think of those American banks, I picture those sleek, modern offices.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other bank is...
A Sharia-compliant bank. We can call it a Sharia bank.
Ah, okay, so we've got this really interesting contrast right from the start.
Yes, and what the researchers wanted to see is how these two banks, with their very distinct cultures, how they handle Islamic modesty in the actual physical spaces of the banks.
That's fascinating. What did they find?
At Sharia Bank, picture really strict adherence to purdah.
So that emphasis on modesty and separation of genders.
Yeah, exactly. Women were mainly working in the back offices.
Oh, wow.
Often with their desks facing the walls, completely separated from male colleagues.
Like almost a step back in time. You know what I mean?
It was. And it didn't stop there. Separate dining areas, separate kitchens, even the prayer rooms were separate.
So it wasn't just physical space. They were actively limiting interaction, too.
Precisely. That had a huge impact on the women's experiences. Many of them said they felt safer in this environment.
I can definitely see that. Feeling protected,
Especially from the harassment that some had faced in other workplaces.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
This segregation, it also limited their interactions with other colleagues and, it really restricted their access to professional development opportunities.
Oh, I see. The classic double-edged sword.
Exactly. Safety on one hand, but limited opportunities on the other.
Wow. It really demonstrates how physical space reflects those deeper norms.
Yeah.
With very real consequences.
Right, you get it. Now let's switch gears to Western Bank, the American one.
Okay, what's the setup there?
It was totally different. Think modern, open design.
Ah, yeah, that globalized approach.
Women had very prominent customer-facing roles.
Interesting. But we're still in Pakistan, so I imagine those ideas about modesty are still important.
Oh, definitely. Even though the physical space wasn't as strict, those norms were still in play.
So how did that play out in their everyday work?
They had to carefully manage those interactions with men.
I see, to avoid appearing inappropriate.
Yeah, they would often choose to engage with men one-on-one or in groups,
Right.
But here's another fascinating layer. Women often relied on their male colleagues to accompany them on client visits.
Really? Even at Western Bank?
Yeah, it was a way of fulfilling those traditional expectations.
So men as protectors.
Exactly, but it also helped the women do their jobs.
So upholding cultural norms while still enabling them to meet clients and stuff.
Exactly.
It's so interesting how those traditional roles still show up even in these, more westernized settings.
It really is, and that's where the authors bring in this really fascinating concept. Selective appropriation of spatial modesty.
Okay, now you got to explain that one. What does that even mean?
Well, it means that women are not just passively accepting these spatial modesty norms, they're actually shaping their own experiences.
So they're taking control, even within these constraints.
Precisely. And we see this happening in both banks in different ways.
Give me an example. How does that actually play out?
So at Sharia Bank, you have a woman who's trying to advance her career, right? And she needs to work closely with a male colleague who has certain expertise.
Tricky situation in that kind of environment.
Totally. So to make sure everyone understood that this was strictly professional, her manager actually made a public announcement instructing the colleague to train her.
Okay. Cool.
And just to emphasize things even further, she made sure to maintain her distance from him.
So working within the system, but still finding ways to push those boundaries.
Exactly.
What about at Western Bank?
Well, some of the women there actually redefined modesty to focus more on avoiding, sexual relationships.
Rather than just limiting all interactions with men.
Right. It was a much more nuanced understanding. It gave them more flexibility.
Makes sense. So it's not just about physical space, right? It's about women navigating cultural expectations in a way that lets them succeed.
You got it. And that's what's so insightful about this research. It shows how these women are actively shaping their own experiences within these complex systems.
It really makes you think about how our surroundings, even subtle things, can impact behavior and opportunity.
Totally. There's so much more to unpack here. Like, what are the broader implications?
Yeah, and how can organizations create more inclusive workplaces, especially when you have diverse cultural settings like this?
Great questions. And we'll dig into those right after this quick break. Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit. Before the break, we were talking about Chaudhry and Priola's research on spatial modesty, remember? Those Pakistani banks.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? How those women in both banks are actively shaping their experiences, not just going along with whatever's imposed on them.
It really challenges how we often think about Muslim women, you know? It shows their agency and resilience.
Now, I'm curious about the men in these banks. Did the researchers talk about how they viewed these gendered spaces?
They did. And it's an important part of the picture. In both banks, men acknowledge those cultural and religious norms. You know, the ones that shaped those spatial practices.
Okay, so they were aware of those influences.
Yeah. They saw those segregated spaces in Sharia bank as a way of, respecting women's modesty, protecting their safety.
Like with that concept of Qiyamah, right? Men as protectors.
Exactly. And even at Western Bank, even with that more open setup, men still felt responsible for protecting women.
Oh, interesting. So even in that environment, they'd accompany women on those client visits like we talked about.
Exactly. To make sure they wouldn't be harassed or anything.
It's interesting how those cultural expectations stay with them, even in these different settings.
It shows how strong those norms are. But, they're not set in stone. They're constantly being, negotiated and reinterpreted.
And that brings us back to selective appropriation of spatial modesty, right? That term the authors use. What do they mean by that?
It's like women choosing which aspects of spatial modesty to emphasize, and which ones to downplay.
So it's a strategy, not just blindly following the rules.
Right. They're using it to achieve their goals.
So what does all this tell us about how physical space and gender dynamics connect in the workplace?
It shows how physical space isn't just neutral. It reflects those cultural and social norms, right? Like the layout of the banks, the segregation, where women are, where they aren't. It all influences how modesty is, performed and experienced.
It's like our surroundings can impact us in these subtle ways, influencing our behavior and even our opportunities.
Definitely. One of the key takeaways is that spatial modesty isn't like a one-size-fits-all thing.
Even in a place like Pakistan, where those Islamic principles are so important.
Exactly. It's interpreted and practiced in so many different ways.
So there's a range of interpretations, even within the same culture.
Yes. Things like family background, education, personal beliefs, those all influence how someone sees modesty.
It's much more complex than just saying this is how it is.
Exactly. And the researchers found this diversity of perspectives in their study.
It really complicates things, doesn't it? Adds another layer.
It does. And that's what makes this research so valuable. It challenges us to move past those simple understandings of gender and culture and really look at how complex they are.
So, real-world implications. What can organizations take from this, especially those working in diverse cultures?
It highlights the need for cultural sensitivity. You can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach when you're designing workspaces or implementing policies.
Makes sense.
You have to be thoughtful and intentional about creating inclusive environments, spaces that respect those diverse cultural values.
Even small things, like the layout of an office, can have a big impact.
Right. And it's not just the physical environment. You have to pay attention to those broader cultural norms and how they might influence what's going on in the workplace.
Look, you need to go deeper than just the surface level diversity initiatives.
You got it. So what can organizations actually do to create more inclusive workplaces, especially in places where spatial modesty matters?
That's the big question. It's great to have all this insight from the research, but I'm really curious about the practical stuff. Like, what can organizations actually do?
That's the key question, right? How do we take all this and turn it into action?
Exactly.
Well, I think the first thing is awareness, really understanding that spatial modesty or any cultural norm that's really ingrained, it's not just some abstract idea.
It's about recognizing that it impacts people's experiences in a concrete way.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have to go beyond awareness and really try to understand how spatial modesty plays out in that specific context,
So what works in one place might not work somewhere else.
Precisely. It's about understanding those nuances. So you might need to talk to employees from different backgrounds or even bring in cultural experts.
Okay, I see.
Maybe do some training for managers and staff, to boost that cultural sensitivity.
So step 1, understand the culture. What's next?
Then you can start thinking about the practical stuff, like how do you design your workspace? What policies do you have in place?
And those need to be inclusive, but also respect those norms.
Right. So, for example, let's say in a certain culture, there's a need for physical separation between genders. You could have private meeting rooms or designated work areas, so those norms are respected, but people can still collaborate.
It's all about finding those creative solutions.
You got it. Balancing those cultural sensitivities with everyone having equal opportunities, right?
This research shows how important it is to be flexible, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That one-size-fits-all approach, it just doesn't work when you have all this cultural diversity.
You need to be able to adapt to different ways of, interpreting and practicing spatial modesty.
Exactly. And another crucial thing is communication. Organizations need to be really open about what they're doing to make the workplace inclusive.
So encourage those conversations.
Yeah, get that dialogue going, especially with employees, to figure out how to best navigate all these complex issues.
It's not just about having the right policies, it's about that whole culture of respect and communication.
You got it. This study really shows how we need to go deeper, understand people's lived experiences, It can't just be surface level stuff.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. Any final thoughts?
I think the main takeaway is that if we really want inclusive workplaces, we can't make those simplistic assumptions.
Right.
We have to really engage with all that complexity, with culture and gender and how people actually experience things.
It's a great reminder that there's no easy answers, but with that awareness and sensitivity, we can create spaces where everyone feels valued.
Exactly.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into spatial modesty.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit for more deep dives, exploring all the fascinating research that shapes our world.
We'll see you next time.